Kang Minho stood in the great council chamber and looked around at the hundreds of alien faces staring back at him. Some had scales, some had fur, some looked like walking crystals. Others had too many eyes, or no eyes at all. But they all shared one thing. They were looking at him with the same cold expression. He had been Earth's ambassador to the Galactic Council for 15 years. In all that time, he had never felt so alone. "The vote is final," said Counselor Kethnara from her high seat. Her crystal body caught the light and threw rainbow colors across the chamber walls. "Humanity is now a probationary species. You will keep only the worlds we give you. You will pay tribute to the Council. You have no vote in our decisions." Ambassador Velthar, a tall reptile with green scales, leaned forward in his chair. His yellow eyes gleamed with satisfaction. "Your species is too violent, too unpredictable. This is for the good of the galaxy." Minho felt his hands shake, but he kept his voice calm. "Counselor, may I remind you what my people have done for this galaxy? We built the quantum tunnels that let your ships travel between stars in days instead of years. Our doctors stopped the plague that was killing millions on Andoria. Our peacekeepers ended 3 wars and saved billions of lives. A creature that looked like a giant bug clicked its mandibles. Anyone could have done those things, but they didn't," Minho said quietly. "We did." The chamber filled with angry buzzing and growling sounds. The aliens did not like being reminded of what humans had accomplished. Kethnara raised one crystal arm for silence. "The decision is made. Earth creature Minho, your species has 3 standard months to comply with our new rules." Minho bowed, his head. There was nothing more to say. The vote had been 731 to 1. Only the old Thanari Regent Kolvash had voted against the motion. Even species that humans had saved from disasters had voted to strip away their rights. "I understand," Minho said. He turned and walked toward the exit, his footsteps echoing in the silent chamber. As he reached the door, he stopped and looked, back one more time. "You know, we really thought we were friends." Nobody answered him. That night, Minho sat in his small apartment near the council building. Through his window, he could see the lights of Nexus Prime, the greatest city in the galaxy. Ships from 1,000 worlds came and went from the spaceport. The quantum tunnel station glowed with blue energy as vessels appeared and disappeared, traveling instantly across vast distances. Humans had built that station. They had designed the tunnels. They had solved the mathematics that made it all possible. Minho picked up his communication device and sent a message to every human colony, every human ship, every human outpost in the galaxy. The message was simple: pack light. We're going home. Within hours, the message had reached Earth, New Sol, the mining stations in the Kepler system, the research bases in the Andromeda sector, and the agricultural worlds in the Outer Rim. Everywhere humans lived, they received the same instruction: pack light. We're going home. Park Ji-won was working late in the engineering section of Nexus Prime when she got the message. She had been trying to fix a problem with the quantum tunnel calibrations. The alien engineers kept adjusting the settings wrong, and ships were arriving several minutes off schedule. She read Minho's message twice, then looked around at her workshop. She had spent 10 years here, building and maintaining the systems that kept the galactic transportation network running. She knew every circuit, every quantum field generator, every piece of equipment. The aliens who worked with her were skilled, but they didn't understand the intuitive part of the work. They could follow procedures, but they couldn't feel when something was wrong with the quantum flow. They couldn't sense the tiny adjustments that kept everything working smoothly. Ji-won began packing her tools into a small bag. She left behind the technical manuals and instruction guides. The aliens could keep those. But the real knowledge, the understanding that came from years of working with quantum fields, that was going home with her. On the agricultural world of Kepler 442b, Song Minji received the message while she was checking her experimental crop fields. She had developed new strains of food plants that could grow in harsh conditions, feeding millions of aliens who lived on worlds with poor soil or bad weather. The local alien farmers watched her work but didn't really understand what she was doing. They saw her take soil samples and adjust nutrient levels, but they thought it was simple chemistry. They didn't realize that successful farming required feeling the rhythm of the land, understanding how plants communicated stress, knowing when to push the ecosystem and when to let it rest. Minji looked at her fields one last time. In a few months, these crops would start failing without her careful adjustments. The aliens would try to maintain them using only her written notes, but farming couldn't be learned from books alone. She walked back to her small house and began packing. In the Central Hospital of Nexus Prime, Dr. Choi Yoonji was finishing her shift in the emergency ward when the message arrived. She had just saved the life of a Zaloti child using a combination of human medical techniques and alien biology knowledge that had taken her 20 years to develop. The child's parents thanked her in their musical language, their crystal bodies chiming with gratitude. They didn't know that in a few hours, she would be gone forever. Yoonji looked around the hospital. Human doctors worked alongside alien healers, sharing knowledge and techniques. But the humans brought something special to medicine: the ability to see patterns that others missed, to make intuitive leaps that saved lives when conventional treatments failed. She packed her personal medical kit and left her research notes in her office. Let the aliens try to replicate her work. They would find that healing required more than just following procedures. All across the galaxy, the same scene played out thousands of times. Human engineers quietly shut down their workstations. Human teachers said goodbye to their alien students. Human traders closed their shops. Human peacekeepers handed over their weapons and walked away from conflicts they had been mediating for years. They didn't make speeches or demands. They didn't threaten anyone or try to cause trouble. They simply packed their few personal belongings and headed for the spaceports. Within 72 hours, every human ship in the galaxy was moving toward the outer rim where humanity's original colonies waited. The ships moved in perfect formation, following routes that avoided the major shipping lanes. They didn't want to cause traffic problems for the species that had voted to exile them. From his office window, Velthar watched the human ships leave. There were more of them than he had expected. He had not realized how many humans lived and worked throughout the galaxy. "Good riddance," he said to his aide. "Now maybe we can have some peace." His aide, a younger member of his species, looked worried. "Sir, what about the quantum tunnels and the hospital systems? The humans ran most of those." Velthar waved a scaly hand dismissively. "We'll figure it out. How hard can it be?" On Earth, President Bae Sumin watched the returning ships arrive. Millions of humans were coming home after decades of living among the stars. They brought with them knowledge and experience from 1,000 worlds, but also sadness at leaving, behind the dream of galactic friendship. "Will we be all right?" asked her aide, Lim Woo-jin. Sumin nodded slowly. "We'll be fine. We always have been. The question is whether they'll be all right without us." The last human ship left Nexus Prime on a Tuesday morning. Minho stood on the observation deck as the station grew smaller behind them. He had spent 15 years trying to build bridges between humanity and the galaxy. Now those bridges were burning. The ship's captain, an old friend named Kim Tae-hyung, joined him at the window. "Any regrets?" Tae-hyung asked. Minho thought for a long moment. "We gave them everything we had. Our knowledge, our friendship, our loyalty. In return, they gave us exile. So no regrets?" Minho smiled sadly. "No regrets about leaving, only regrets about what we're leaving behind." As their ship entered the quantum tunnel for the last time, neither man knew that they were taking with them the very foundation of galactic civilization. In their minds, they carried the solutions to problems the galaxy didn't even know it had yet. Behind them, the great machine of interstellar society continued to run on momentum and habit. But the engineers were gone. The doctors were gone. The teachers and peacekeepers and farmers were gone, and soon, very soon, the galaxy would begin to understand what it had lost. 6 months had passed since the last human ship disappeared into the quantum tunnels. On Nexus Prime, Counselor Kethanera stood before a massive display screen showing the galaxy's communication network. Green lights indicated healthy connections between worlds. Yellow lights showed minor problems. Red lights meant serious failures. There were more yellow lights than there used to be. "Report," she said to Director Morgeth, an insect-like creature, with 4 arms and compound eyes that could see in multiple spectrums. Morgeth's mandibles clicked nervously. "The communication delays are getting worse. Messages that used to take minutes now take hours. Sometimes they don't arrive at all." "What's causing it? We're not sure." The human Lee Hyun-woo designed the translation protocols that let all our species talk to each other. His systems are breaking down and we can't figure out how to fix them. Kethnara's crystal body dimmed slightly. She remembered Lee Hyun-woo, a quiet human who had spent years learning the languages and thought patterns of every species in the galaxy. His translation system was more than just converting words. It translated concepts, emotions, cultural references that made real communication possible. "Get our best linguists on it," she ordered. "We have, Counselor, but they don't understand how Hyun-woo made it work." His notes say things like, "Adjust for cultural emotional context, and compensate for species-specific conceptual frameworks." Our linguists don't know what those mean. On the industrial world of Kepler 442, the automated factories that Park Ji-won had designed were starting to shut down. The alien engineers stood helplessly as production lines that had run perfectly for years began to malfunction. "Why won't it work?" demanded Supervisor Theknol, a creature that looked like a walking tree with too many branches. Engineer Zilforth examined the diagnostic display. "The humans' notes say to listen to the machines and adjust based on their needs." "I don't understand what that means." "Machines don't have needs," Theknol said. "They just follow programming." But as they watched, another production line ground to a halt. The diagnostic systems showed no obvious problems, but somehow the delicate balance that kept everything working had been lost. Zilforth tried adjusting the settings according to the manual, but that only made things worse. The machines seemed to resist his changes, as if they were waiting for someone who understood their language. In the central hospital, Dr. Yankala struggled with a patient whose condition didn't match any of his textbooks. The Thanari elder was dying, but none of the standard treatments were working. "Get me the human medical files," he told his assistant. We have them all, Doctor. Dr. Choi Eun-ji left very detailed notes. Yankala scrolled through Eun-ji's records, looking for similar cases. He found several, but her treatment notes were frustrating. Patient shows signs of emotional distress affecting physical healing, she had written. Adjusted treatment to address psychological factors. Recovery improved after addressing patient's fear of abandonment. How do you adjust treatment for emotions? Yankala muttered. Medicine is about biology, not feelings. But as he watched his patient grow weaker, he began to wonder if the humans had understood something about healing that his species had missed. The problems weren't limited to technology and medicine. On the diplomatic world of Centauri Prime, Ambassador Feltar was trying to mediate a trade dispute between two species who had been friends for centuries. The Vreen took our shipment without paying, complained the Aquari representative. We paid according to the old agreement, replied the Vreen delegate. Feltar looked through the trade documents, trying to find the source of the confusion. Everything seemed to be in order, but somehow both species felt cheated. In the past, human mediator Kim Tae-hyung would have resolved this in minutes with a few carefully chosen words and an understanding smile. The argument escalated. Voices rose. The Aquari delegate slammed his fins on the table. The Vreen representative buzzed angrily. Perhaps we should take a break, Feltar suggested, but it was too late. Both delegations stormed out, and a trade relationship that had lasted 300 years crumbled in an afternoon. Back on Nexus Prime, Keth Nara was receiving more troubling reports. The quantum tunnel network was becoming unreliable. Ships were arriving late, sometimes by days. A few had arrived at completely the wrong destinations. The tunnels are losing calibration, reported Chief Engineer Bektos. We keep adjusting them according to the human procedures, but something's not working right. What do the manuals say? That's the problem, Counselor. The manuals tell us what to do, but not why. Park Ji-won's notes mention things like feeling the quantum flow and intuitive adjustments based on spatial resonance. We don't know what those mean. Kethnara felt a growing sense of unease. When the humans left, she had assumed their knowledge could be easily replicated. After all, they were just one species among hundreds. How unique could their abilities really be? But the evidence was mounting that humans saw connections and patterns that other species missed. Their technology worked not just because of engineering, skill, but because of some intuitive understanding that couldn't be captured in instruction manuals. On the agricultural world where Song Minji had worked, the crop yields were dropping. The alien farmers followed her growing guides exactly, but the plants weren't thriving. The soil chemistry is perfect, reported agricultural specialist Corvend. The nutrients are balanced. The irrigation timing matches the human schedule. Exactly. But the crops looked sickly. The genetically modified plants that had fed millions were producing smaller harvests every week. Maybe we need to call in experts from other worlds, suggested his assistant. Corvend had already tried that. Agricultural specialists from a dozen species had examined the fields and found nothing wrong with the technical aspects. The chemistry was right. The genetics were stable. The environmental conditions were ideal. Yet somehow the vital spark that had made Minji's farming methods so successful was missing. The plants grew, but they didn't thrive. They survived, but they didn't flourish. Watching his failing crops, Corvend began to suspect that successful farming required more than just following procedures. It needed something the humans called green thumb, an intuitive feel for what plants needed that couldn't be taught from books. The communication problems were spreading. On distant worlds, alien species were struggling to understand each other without human translators. Lee Hyun-woo's automated systems handled the basic language conversion, but they were losing the subtle cultural understanding that prevented misunderstandings. A simple trade negotiation between the crystalline Zeloti and the aquatic Aquari broke down when the translation system failed to convey the emotional undertones of their words. What the Zeloti meant as friendly enthusiasm came across as aggressive demands. What the Aquari intended as careful consideration sounded like insulting delays. Both species blamed each other for the failed negotiations, not realizing that they were victims of a communication system that was slowly forgetting how to translate the heart as well as the words. In the council chambers, Velthar was growing frustrated with the constant reports of minor problems. "These are just temporary difficulties," he told his staff. "We'll adapt. We'll find new solutions." But privately, he was beginning to worry. The problems were small individually, but they were everywhere. Equipment that had worked perfectly for years was breaking down. Negotiations that should have been simple were falling apart. Even basic communication between species was becoming difficult. His aide brought him another report. "Sir, the medical stations in the Outer Rim are requesting emergency assistance. They're dealing with an outbreak of Rigelian fever, but they can't replicate the human treatment protocols. What's the problem? Don't we have the medicine?" "We have the chemicals, sir. But Dr. Choi Yoonji's notes say the treatment requires careful observation of patient response and intuitive adjustment of dosage based on individual healing patterns. The alien doctors don't know what that means." Velthar crumpled the report. "Intuitive adjustment? What kind of nonsense is that? Medicine is science, not guesswork." But even as he said it, he remembered watching human doctors work. They had seemed to know things about their patients that couldn't be measured with instruments. They could predict who would recover and who wouldn't, often before the test results came back. At the time, he had thought it was just luck or experience. Now he was beginning to wonder if the humans possessed some form of insight that other species lacked. As reports continued to pour in from across the galaxy, a disturbing pattern was emerging. Every system that humans had designed or improved was slowly failing. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually and consistently. The failures weren't due to sabotage or deliberate damage. The humans had left behind complete technical manuals, detailed procedures, and comprehensive training materials. They had tried to teach other species how to maintain their systems, but teaching someone to follow a procedure was different from teaching them to understand the deeper principles that made the procedure work. The aliens could operate human technology, but they couldn't adapt it or improve it or even maintain it properly when unexpected problems arose. Keth Nara stood in her office late one evening, looking out at the city lights of Nexus Prime. 2 years had passed since the humans left, and the galaxy was breaking. Prime Coordinator Zendal of the Aquari Worlds stood in his underwater palace, staring at the massive display screens that showed the status of his civilization. Red warning. Lights blinked everywhere. The water purification systems that kept his people's oceans clean were failing across dozens of worlds. "How long do we have?" he asked his chief engineer. 3 months, maybe 4, replied the engineer, her gills fluttering with stress. "The human-designed purifiers are shutting down one by one. We've tried everything, but we can't make them work." Zendal's tentacles curled in frustration. The humans had built those purification systems 20 years ago, turning poisoned oceans into clean water that could support billions of Aquari. The technology seemed simple enough, just complex filters and chemical treatments. But somehow, every time the aliens tried to repair or maintain them, something went wrong. What do the instruction manuals say? They tell us which buttons to push and which chemicals to add. But when problems happen, the manuals say things like, adjust based on environmental conditions and use intuitive judgment to balance the ecosystem. We don't know what that means. On the other side of the galaxy, the Centauri system was in chaos. 3 different species were fighting over mining rights that had been peacefully shared for decades. What started as a simple disagreement had escalated into armed conflict. General Kexmar of the Thanari military watched from his command. Ship as laser fire lit up the asteroid fields. His peacekeeping forces were trying to stop the fighting, but they didn't know how. In the old days, the humans would have ended this in hours, said his aide, Colonel Vintesh. Kexmar nodded grimly. He remembered watching human mediator Kim Tai-hyung work. The man had an uncanny ability to understand what people really wanted, even when they didn't say it directly. He could find solutions that made everyone feel like they had won. Kim always said the key was listening to what wasn't being said, Kexmar muttered. But how do you listen to silence? Another explosion lit up his view screen as a Vreen mining ship was destroyed. 3 crew members dead over a dispute that should have been resolved with a simple conversation. The communication network was in shambles. Lee Hunwoo's translation systems were producing more and more errors. Simple messages were being mistranslated in ways that caused anger and confusion. Director Morgeth stood in the communications center on Nexus Prime, watching his technicians struggle with the failing equipment. On the main screen, an angry Zalodi diplomat was shouting at an Aquari ambassador, but the translation system was making everything worse. The Zalodi is trying to apologize for the trade delay, explained technician Yilkova, but the translator is making it sound like he's threatening to cut off all trade forever. Can't we fix it? We've tried, sir, but Lee Hyunwoo's system doesn't just translate words. It understands cultural context, emotional undertones, historical relationships between species. We don't know how to program that kind of understanding. Morgeth watched as the diplomatic meeting fell apart completely. The Aquari ambassador stormed out, ending a trade relationship that had lasted 2 centuries. It was the 15th such breakdown this month. The medical crisis was spreading across multiple worlds. On Rigel 7, Dr. Yankala stood in his hospital's emergency ward, looking at patients he couldn't help. The Rigelian fever outbreak had infected thousands, and the human-developed treatment wasn't working when the aliens tried to use it. 10. Medicine is correct, his assistant reported. The dosages matched Dr. Choi Yoonji's protocols exactly, but patients were still dying. Yankala had read Yoonji's research files dozens of times. She wrote about reading the patient's energy and adjusting treatment based on individual healing patterns. She talked about medicine as if it were an art as much as a science. She treated each patient differently even when they had the same disease, Yankala said to himself. But how did she know what changes to make? A young Rigelian in the next bed was struggling to breathe. According to the protocols, he should have been recovering by now. But Yankala could see that something was wrong, something the instruments couldn't measure. He thought about what Yoonji might have done. She had always spent long periods just talking to her patients, learning about their lives and fears and hopes. She seemed to believe that healing required understanding the whole person, not just the disease. On impulse, Yankala sat down beside the young patient and began to ask questions. Not medical questions, but personal ones. About his family, his work, his dreams. As they talked, Yankala noticed something change in the patient's expression. The fear in his eyes lessened. His breathing became slightly easier. It wasn't a cure, but it was something. Maybe the humans had been right about the connection between mind and body. Maybe healing really did require more than just chemistry. The agricultural disasters were spreading. On world after world, the crops that Song Minji had developed were failing. The genetically modified plants that had fed billions were producing smaller harvests each season. Agricultural specialist Corvend stood in his dying fields, surrounded by experts from a dozen species. They had run every test imaginable. The soil was perfect. The genetics were stable. The environmental conditions were ideal. "It doesn't make sense," said Dr. Fal Rance, a plant geneticist from the Zaloti homeworld. "These crops should be thriving." But they weren't. The plants grew, but they looked sad somehow. They produced food, but not enough. It was as if they were missing something essential that couldn't be measured or tested. Song Minji used to say that plants had feelings, Corvend said quietly. She claimed she could sense when they were stressed or happy. The other scientists made dismissive sounds. Plants didn't have feelings. That was ridiculous. But as Corvend looked at his failing crops, he wondered if maybe the humans had understood something about life that the other species had missed. Maybe successful farming required more than just providing the right chemicals and conditions. Maybe it needed care, attention, and yes, even love. In the depths of space, the quantum tunnel network was collapsing. Ships that should have taken days to cross the galaxy were taking weeks or months. Some vessels were getting lost entirely, emerging from tunnels in completely wrong sectors. Chief Engineer Bektos worked frantically in the control center, trying to recalibrate the tunnel generators. Park Ji-won's technical manuals covered every component and procedure, but they couldn't capture the intuitive understanding that had made her such a master engineer. "The quantum fields are unstable in Sector 7, reported his assistant. Bektos consulted the manual. It told him to adjust the field harmonics based on local space-time conditions, but it didn't explain how to sense those conditions or what adjustments to make. He tried different settings, but each change seemed to make things worse. The tunnel became even more unstable, forcing him to shut it down completely. An entire sector of the galaxy was now cut off from fast travel. Ji-won always said you had to feel the quantum flow, Bektos muttered. But how do you feel something that doesn't exist in normal space? The economic systems were breaking down too. Trade routes that had operated smoothly for decades were falling, apart as communication failures and transportation delays made commerce nearly impossible. On the trading world of Nova Market, merchant Prince Dolvek watched his empire crumble. The complex financial networks that human traders had helped establish were collapsing as trust between species eroded. "Nobody wants to trade anymore," his aide reported. "The Vreen think the Aquari are trying to cheat them. The Zaloti believe the Thanari are plotting against them. Everyone suspects everyone else of bad faith." Dolvek remembered the human traders who had worked in his markets. They had seemed to understand the subtle psychology of commerce, when to push for a better deal and when to accept what was offered, how to build trust between species who thought differently, how to find solutions that made everyone feel successful. "They made it look so easy," he said sadly. But they were holding the whole system together with their reputation and relationships. Without humans to vouch for deals and mediate disputes, the intricate web of galactic commerce was unraveling. Species that had traded peacefully for centuries were now viewing each other with suspicion and hostility. The education systems were failing, too. On dozens of worlds, alien children struggled with concepts that human teachers had made seem simple. Han Na-young's teaching methods had worked across hundreds of different species, somehow adapting to different learning styles and mental patterns. The human understood how we think, said Teacher Morval on the Zeloti homeworld. She could explain things in ways that made sense to our crystalline minds. Now our children can't learn basic mathematics or science. The same story was repeated across the galaxy. Human teachers had possessed an almost magical ability to reach any kind of student, to find the right metaphor or example that would make difficult concepts clear. Without them, entire generations of young aliens were falling behind in their education. As the crisis deepened, some species began to blame the humans for their problems. They sabotaged their own systems before leaving, claimed Senator Velkoff in the council chambers. This is revenge for our vote. 5 years had passed since the humans left. The Galactic Council now controlled fewer than 200 worlds, down from the thousands that had once been connected by quantum tunnels and united by trade and friendship. Regent Kolvash stood on the observation deck of his personal ship, looking out at the dead space where the Vreen homeworld used to be. The planet was still there, but the civilization was gone. The water purification systems had failed completely, poisoning the oceans. The Vreen had fought each other for the remaining clean water until their society collapsed. How many more? He asked his aide quietly. 17 species have gone extinct. Sir, 23 others have lost spaceflight capability and retreated to their homeworlds. The Skari are fighting a civil war. The Aquari worlds are mostly uninhabitable now. Kolvash closed his old eyes. He was one of the few beings left who remembered what the galaxy had been like before the humans arrived. It had been smaller, quieter, less connected. Species lived on their own worlds and rarely traveled far from home. Then humanity had joined the council, and everything changed. The humans built bridges, not just the quantum tunnels that connected distant stars, but bridges of understanding between species who had never been able to communicate properly before. Sir, his aide continued, we're approaching the human territories. Should we send our request for a meeting? Kolvash had been dreading this moment for months. As one of the few council members who had voted against exiling humanity, he had been chosen to make contact. The mission was simple in concept, but devastating in its implications. Beg the humans to return and save what was left of galactic civilization. Send. The message, he said. 2 days later, Kolvash's ship entered orbit around New Sol, one of humanity's outer colonies. The planet looked peaceful from space. Green continents, blue oceans, white clouds. As they descended through the atmosphere, he could see cities that seemed to grow organically from the landscape, technology that enhanced rather than dominated the natural world. The contrast with the polluted, overcrowded worlds of the failing galactic civilization was stark. A shuttle met them at the orbital station. The pilot was a young human woman who greeted them politely but without enthusiasm. She guided them down to the planet's surface, where they were met by Bae Sumin, now the elected leader of the Human Confederation. Sumin was older than Kolvash remembered, but she still carried herself with quiet dignity. She welcomed the alien delegation to a simple building that served as the Confederation's council chamber. No massive halls or impressive displays of power, just a comfortable room with large windows that looked out on gardens and forests. Regent Kolvash, Sumin said, offering him a seat. It's been a long time. Also present was Lim Wu-jin, now an elderly philosopher who had once served as an advisor to human ambassadors. His hair was white, but his eyes were still sharp and kind. "You know why we're here," Kolvash said without preamble. "The galaxy is dying." Sumin nodded. "We've been watching. It's tragic, but not surprising. Will you help us?" The question hung in the air for a long moment. Finally, Lim Wu-jin spoke. "Help you do what exactly? Return to the same system that exiled us? Resume our roles as the invisible servants who kept everything working while being told we were inferior?" Kolvash felt his heart sink. "I voted against the exile. I tried to stop it." "We know," Sumin said gently, "and we're grateful for that. But one voice out of hundreds doesn't change what happened." "Things would be different now," Kolvash insisted. "You could have full representation on the council, equal status, even leadership positions." Lim Wu-jin smiled sadly. "Do you know what we learned during our time in the galaxy? We learned that our way of thinking is fundamentally different from yours. We see connections where you see separate parts. We understand systems where you understand components." He gestured toward the window, where they could see humans working in the gardens. "Watch our people work. They don't just plant crops or tend machines. They participate in ecosystems. They become part of the systems they're working with." Kolvash followed his gaze. He could see humans moving through the gardens with a fluid grace, making tiny adjustments that seemed random but somehow created harmony. It looked like art more than agriculture. "Your species are brilliant in many ways," Lim Wu-jin continued. "You've mastered individual sciences and technologies, but you think in straight lines. Cause and effect, problem and solution. You can't see the web of connections that holds everything together." "So teach us," Kolvash pleaded. "We tried for 200 years, Sumin said. We wrote manuals, gave lectures, demonstrated techniques. We shared everything we knew. But you can't teach someone to see patterns they're not capable of recognizing." She stood and walked to a wall display that showed images from across the galaxy. Dying worlds, failed systems, collapsed civilizations. "Do you know what the real tragedy is? We saw this coming. We tried to warn the Council that the systems were too interconnected to be maintained by committee. We explained that galactic civilization required constant adjustment and adaptation, but we were told we were being dramatic." Lim Wu-jin joined her at the display. "Your species are like master musicians who can play individual instruments beautifully. But you can't hear the harmony that makes an orchestra work. You can't feel the rhythm that holds the music together." Kolvash looked at the images of destruction and felt despair settle in his chest. "So there's nothing we can do? The galaxy will just end?" "Not end," Sumin said quietly. "Change. Some species will adapt and find new ways to live. Others will retreat to simpler ways of existence. A few might even develop new approaches to cooperation." She touched a control, and the display changed to show the human worlds. Thriving cities, clean oceans, peaceful cooperation between settlements. "We're not hiding here out of spite," she explained. "We're building something new, a civilization, based on integration rather than domination, cooperation rather than competition, harmony rather than control." "But you could have both," Kolvash argued. "You could help us rebuild and also maintain your own civilization." Lim Wu-jin shook his head. "You still don't understand. We can't be part of a system that sees us as tools rather than partners. The moment we return, we'd become the servants again. The galaxy would become dependent on us, but would never truly respect us. How can you say that? After seeing what happened when you left, how can you think we don't respect your abilities? Because respect based on need isn't real respect, Suman said firmly. When you voted to exile us, you weren't just rejecting our political participation. You were rejecting our essential nature. You wanted our gifts, but not our perspectives. Our solutions, but not our methods. Our results, but not our values. The room fell silent except for the sound of wind in the trees outside. Kolvash could feel his last hope slipping away. What about individual species? He asked desperately. What if some of us approached you separately, not as the council, but as refugees seeking help? Suman and Lim Wu Jin exchanged a look. Finally, Suman spoke. Any species that comes to us with genuine humility and a willingness to learn, not just to benefit but to truly understand, will be welcomed. We've already helped 3 small civilizations that lost spaceflight capability. But they came as students, not as masters demanding service. They had to abandon their old ways of thinking, Lim Wu Jin added. They had to accept that their previous approaches weren't working. They had to be willing to see the universe differently. Kolvash felt a small spark of hope. And if entire species were willing to do that, then they might survive what's coming, Suman said. But it won't be easy. It means giving up the illusion of control. It means accepting that some problems can't be solved by force or logic alone. It means learning to work with systems instead of trying to dominate them. As the day ended, Kolvash prepared to return to his ship. The humans had been generous with their time and patient with his questions. But they had been clear. There would be no grand return to save galactic civilization. The old system was gone forever. I have one last question, he said as they stood in the garden outside the council building. Do you miss it? The galaxy as it was? Lim Wu Jin looked up at the stars beginning to appear in the evening sky. We miss the dream of what it could have been. We miss the friendships we built with individuals from other species. We miss the feeling of working together toward something greater than ourselves. He paused, then continued. But we don't miss being taken for granted. We don't miss having our contributions minimized while our methods were criticized. We don't miss being seen as a problem to be managed rather than partners to be valued. Suman walked them to the shuttle landing pad. Tell the council that humanity wishes them well. We hope they find new ways to build civilization that don't depend on exploiting any single species, and tell them that our door is always open to those who come seeking genuine partnership rather than convenient solutions. As Kolvash's shuttle lifted off from New Sol, he looked down at the peaceful human cities glowing softly in the darkness. They had found a way to live in harmony with their world and with each other. They had built something beautiful and sustainable. Meanwhile, across the galaxy, ancient civilizations were crumbling because they had never learned the secret. 10 years had passed since the humans left. The great halls of the Galactic Council on Nexus Prime echoed with emptiness. Where once thousands of representatives from hundreds of species had gathered to govern a thriving interstellar civilization, now fewer than 50 delegates huddled in a chamber too large for their diminished numbers. Counselor Kethnera stood at the central podium, her crystal form dim with age and sorrow. The rainbow lights that had once danced across her surface were barely visible now. The motion before us today, she said to the sparse assembly, is the formal dissolution of the Galactic Council. A few scattered voices raised weak objections, but everyone knew it was over. The galaxy they had once ruled was dark and fragmented. Most species had retreated to their homeworlds or formed small local alliances. The dream of a unified galactic civilization had died with the quantum tunnel network. In the back of the chamber, Ambassador Velthar sat alone. The proud Skari had aged badly. His scales were dull, his eyes clouded. His own homeworld was barely habitable now, torn apart by resource wars and environmental collapse. "I call for a final vote," Kethanara announced. The result was inevitable. The Galactic Council officially ended its 10,000-year existence with a whimper, not a roar. As the delegates filed out for the last time, Velthar remained in his seat. He remembered the day the humans had been exiled, how satisfied he had felt, how certain he had been that the galaxy would be better without their disruptive influence. Now his own species was extinct, except for a few scattered survivors living in refugee camps on alien worlds. On the other side of the galaxy, a very different scene was taking place. The human world of New Sol was hosting a celebration, the 10th anniversary of the Confederation's founding. The event was simple but joyful, with music, food, and storytelling under the open sky. Bay Suman, now elderly, but still sharp, stood before a gathering of humans and their alien guests. Yes, there were aliens here. Members of species that had approached humanity with genuine humility and a desire to learn. 10 years ago, she said, we thought we were going into exile. We thought we were losing our place in the galaxy, but instead, we found our true purpose. In the crowd, she could see representatives from the Kalani, a young species that had never joined the original council. They had come to humanity seeking help with environmental problems on their homeworld. Instead of demanding solutions, they had asked to learn human methods of ecological harmony. There were also some Thanari survivors, refugees from the civil wars that had torn their civilization apart. Regent Kolvash, now very old, had led a small group of his people to seek sanctuary with the humans. They had abandoned their old ways of rigid hierarchy and were learning to live more cooperatively. We learned that true civilization isn't about controlling others, Suman continued. It's about understanding ourselves and our place in the web of life that connects all things. In a garden nearby, Lim Wu-jin sat with a group of young people, humans and aliens together, teaching them about systems thinking. At 90, he was one of the last humans who remembered the old galactic civilization. The council thought in terms of dominance, he was saying to his students. Who controls what? Who has power over whom? But humans think in terms of relationships. How do things connect? How do they influence each other? How can we work together instead of against each other? A young Kalani raised her hand. Teacher. Lim, why didn't the council species understand this? Lim Wu-jin smiled. They weren't stupid or evil. They just saw the universe differently. Their minds were shaped by millions of years of evolution that rewarded competition and individual survival. They were very good at fighting and conquering and controlling. But humans are different? Humans learned to cooperate very early in our evolution. We survived not by being the strongest or fastest, but by working together. That shaped how we think about everything, even technology and science and politics. One of the Thanari students, a young female named Yonara, spoke up. But isn't competition natural? Isn't it how things improve? Competition has its place, Lim Wu-jin agreed. But cooperation is more powerful. A forest where trees compete against each other dies. A forest where trees share nutrients and support each other thrives. Back on Nexus Prime, the city was slowly emptying. Without the Council to maintain order and the human-built infrastructure to support commerce, there was little reason for most species to remain. The great spaceport that had once welcomed ships from across the galaxy now saw only a few vessels each day. Kathanara stood in her private office, packing the last of her belongings. Through her window, she could see the abandoned buildings and empty streets. In the distance, one of the human-built power plants flickered and went dark. Another piece of the old civilization giving up. Her communication device chimed, a message from the human world of New Sol. She hesitated, then opened it. It was an invitation. The humans were hosting a conference on sustainable civilization, bringing together species that wanted to learn new ways of living. They were offering to share their knowledge freely with anyone willing to approach as a student rather than a master. Kathanara stared at the invitation for a long time. The proud part of her, the part that had ruled an empire, wanted to delete it. How dare they offer charity to a being who had once held authority over them? But the wiser part of her, the part that had watched everything fall apart, knew better. The humans weren't offering charity. They were offering hope. She composed a careful reply, asking if there might be room at the conference for an old council member who wanted to learn rather than teach. On New Sol, Suman read Kathanara's message with mixed emotions. She remembered the crystalline being who had coldly announced humanity's exile. But she also remembered the earlier years when Kathanara had been more open to human ideas. "What do you think?" she asked Lim Wu-jin. The old philosopher considered. "Everyone deserves a chance to grow, even former enemies, especially former enemies." Suman sent back a welcome message. There would always be room for those willing to learn. As the human conference began, delegates from dozens of species gathered to discuss new approaches to civilization. Not the grand, controlling empire that the Council had tried to build, but smaller, more sustainable communities that worked with natural systems rather than against them. Dr. Choi Eunji, now in her 70s but still practicing medicine, demonstrated healing techniques that integrated emotional and spiritual care with physical treatment. Alien doctors watched in amazement as she helped patients recover not just from disease, but from despair. Engineer Park Ji-won, her hair now silver, taught young aliens how to build technology that enhanced rather than dominated the natural world. Her students learned to see machines as partners rather than tools, to work with materials rather than force them into unnatural shapes. Former diplomat Kim Tae-hyung led workshops on conflict resolution, showing how understanding and empathy could solve problems that force and logic could not. Alien mediators practiced his techniques, learning to hear the unspoken needs behind angry words. The conference wasn't about recreating the old galactic civilization. It was about building something new, a network of communities connected by friendship and mutual aid rather than hierarchy and control. Some species, like the young Kalani, embraced these ideas quickly. Others, like the surviving Thanari, struggled to overcome millions of years of competitive thinking. But all were trying, and that made all the difference. As the conference ended, Kathanara approached Suman for a private conversation. "I owe you an apology," the old Zalodi said. "Not just for the exile, but for never understanding what you were trying to teach us." Suman smiled gently. "We all make mistakes. The important thing is learning from them." "Is there really no way to rebuild what we had?" Kathanara asked. The galactic civilization was beautiful in its scope and ambition. It was beautiful, Sumin agreed. But it was also fragile. Any system that depends on one group doing all the work while others take the credit is doomed to fail. She gestured toward the conference participants, now saying their goodbyes and planning future meetings. This might be smaller, but it's stronger. Each community that learns to live sustainably becomes a seed that can spread these ideas to others. Instead of one massive civilization that could collapse overnight, we're building a web of connections that can survive almost anything. Years passed. The new network of cooperative communities grew slowly but steadily. Some of the old council species adapted and joined. Others couldn't overcome their need for dominance and faded away. The galaxy became quieter but also healthier. Wars became rare as species learned that cooperation was more rewarding than conquest. Environmental destruction slowed as communities learned to work with their worlds rather than exploit them. And in quiet corners of the galaxy, young beings of many species gathered to learn from human teachers who shared the secrets of systems. Thinking, of seeing connections instead of competition, of understanding that true strength came from helping others rather than defeating them. The humans had departed in silence when they were rejected, but they had returned in whispers, not as rulers or saviors, but as friends and teachers for those ready to learn. The old galactic civilization was gone forever,